Archiving started.
Fourth, whether to revise my models PowerPoint or just do a supplement. And for right now, I'm going to do this supplement. And the reason is, I think over the years, I haven't given enough attention to the DSM model. Well, we do follow the public health model, and we do, in human services. So much of what we do is guided by the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. People can't be placed in treatment if they don't have a diagnosis. And I want to make sure we focus on this little teeny tiny one aspect of the DSM. So this is still a model. It actually makes up part of the public health model. And some of the academic model makes up the DSM5 model. And so I'm not trying to confuse you. It's just another way of communicating that someone has a problem with substances. And so where the moral model is very negative and says this person is a failure as a human being, well, that's one way to view substance use disorders. But there are other ways of viewing it. And the DSM-5 gives us a way to interpret it and bill for services. A lot of people will not get paid if they're working with someone who does not have a DSM-5 diagnosis. So let me skip to the next slide and kind of talk a little bit about the DSM. Problem with the DSM is really it's not used the way it was intended. If you look at it, what exactly does that mean? Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. We know that diagnostic means to give someone a diagnosis. So your head is stuffy, you're sneezing, the mucus has changed colors, you feel icky and feverish, you have a sinus infection. That's a diagnosis. We took signs and symptoms and we made a diagnosis. But what the statistical part is really the DSM was designed to be used for research purposes, to actually delve into, well, do these disorders actually exist? And to what degree do they exist? The funny thing is if you buy one of those little pocket-sized DSM-5 books, you will probably not see any of the statistical stuff because people don't really use it for that. They use it to diagnose different psychiatric disorders. So we use it because quite frequently, if you don't have someone who meets the criteria in the DSM, then they won't actually be admitted for treatment because they won't have anyone who'll pay for their treatment. Why this is very important to us is there are more diagnoses in the substance use disorder section than any other section. Now, I kind of focus on alcohol in this PowerPoint just kind of to make it a little simpler. But, and also your Loosening the Grip book focuses exclusively on alcohol. So, but you can find all sorts of, there are so many diagnoses. There are over 100 in that section alone. And part of it is because you've got so many different substances. You've got alcohol, you've got cocaine, you've got cannabis, you have phencyclidine, you have opiates, you have amphetamines, so forth and so on. And then you have different conditions that occur with those various substances. So you can have alcohol withdrawal, you can have amphetamine psychosis. You can have cocaine use disorder, mild, moderate, and severe. And when you put together all the different combinations of what can go wrong with various substances, it leads to a lot of diagnoses. Unless you happen to work in a detox unit or a hospital, you probably won't see a lot of the, things like alcohol withdrawal, because for the most part, people will come to you already detoxed from alcohol. But if they happen to be in a detox facility, yeah, you'll see alcohol withdrawal. So for the purposes of this slide or presentation, I pretty much stick to alcohol use, but understand that it covers many other substances, not just alcohol. It's just easier to focus on one. I don't trip over my tongue quite as much. And so one of the things that you may need to be aware of, especially if you've been in the field for a while, the biggest change as far as our field is concerned is that the new DSM, which came out in May 2013, is that we got rid of the abuse and dependence diagnoses. And there are a lot of reasons for this. Some of them were political, and some of them are these really good descriptors of what we're seeing when someone is having an issue with substance use. And one of the things the Loosening the Grip book points out is that people diagnosed with substance abuse, when there were long studies done, didn't actually turn into people who had dependence. And so maybe that wasn't exactly the best designate for that diagnosis. And so instead, what they did is they put the diagnoses more on a spectrum. And if you think about it, that's probably a better way of doing it. So think about it this way. If I say it's hot or it's cold, you lose the spectrum. You don't really know what that means. And so when I say it's hot, do I mean it's 85 or do I mean it's 102? There's a big difference between 85 and 102. And that's the same if I say it's cold. Do I mean it's 40 degrees or do I mean it's 16? Again, big difference between 40 and 16. And so when I said that someone has alcohol dependence under the old criteria, I was describing someone who probably has a couple DUIs, may have been divorced, may have been fired from his job, is, running the risk of being evicted from his apartment, is drinking more than intended. He's estranged from his family, and he's showing signs of tolerance by needing more alcohol to get the same effect. Okay, he qualified for alcohol dependence. But what about the guy who has been drinking for 40 years? He goes through withdrawal when he does not drink. When he drinks, he actually has experienced reverse tolerance, where he has consumed so much alcohol, his body has pretty much stopped processing it, so that he is as drunk as he's going to get, regardless of the amount. It's called reverse tolerance. He's in late-stage liver failure due to his alcoholism. And he continues to drink. There's a little bit of difference between the two of them. The first guy probably under the new criteria would be alcohol use disorder moderate, and the second guy would be alcohol use disorder severe. And I didn't actually sit there and count symptoms, so I may not have given enough for the second guy. But if I had gone through and thought it a little more clearly, I probably would have reached that. Now, see, that communicates more. So if I say to you, we've got a guy coming in, he meets the criteria for alcohol use disorder moderate, you're like, oh, okay, I got you. You don't know exactly what criteria he met, but he only met 5 or 4 or 5. Whereas if I say, yeah, we've got a guy coming in and he's alcohol use disorder severe, that communicates information to you. And so it's on a spectrum. It gives you a better perspective of what you're going to be dealing with. And so here are how you identify the severity. You count the symptoms in a 12-month period. And DSM is very, very big on time frames. You will see this with things like post-traumatic stress as opposed to acute stress disorder. You will see it with major depression. Everybody, and especially with your manic episodes, the difference between bipolar 1 and bipolar 2. DSM is very, very particular about time frames. And so in order to diagnose a use disorder, it has to take place over the course of 12 months. Sometimes that causes problems with drugs like cocaine and methamphetamine, where people can become, they can get in trouble very, very quickly with those substances. But under the new DSM5, if you have only 2 or 3 symptoms, you will meet use disorder mild. If you have 4 to 5 symptoms, it'll be moderate. If you have 6 or more symptoms, it'll be severe. And so you can see, I wrote it out, alcohol use disorder mild, cocaine use disorder moderate, amphetamine use disorder severe. Now, all of these comes with codes, and I didn't bother to write the codes because you're not going to be required to remember those in this class. They kept the codes from the old DSM. So the alcohol use disorder mild code is the old alcohol abuse code. And it's the same with the cocaine use disorder moderate or severe. Both of those are the old cocaine dependence code, 304.2. Same with amphetamine use disorder severe. That's the old amphetamine dependence code. Now, they did make some changes. And for those of you who never worked with DSM-4, this really doesn't matter to you, but it actually is very interesting as to why they made some of the changes. One of the things they took out, especially from what was the criteria for the use disorder, is they dropped the criteria related to recurring legal problems. And they did that for a couple of reasons. One is being arrested is really a matter of chance, if you think about it. It's a time, it's a resource-based conundrum. And so if you happen to have a lot of police officers, you can arrest a lot of people. If you have a DUI checkpoint, you're more likely to arrest a lot of people. But who are you missing? What about the people who just go home and stay home and get drunk there? So it's not really a good foundation for a criteria if it's based on chance. But the other issue, which I thought was interesting because I've spent much of my professional career working with court-ordered people, is that right now research is showing that legal problems in people with substance use disorders. Only 3% for alcohol, 6% for heroin, and 12% for cocaine. Which I was like, that is really low. But it tells you how hidden the problem of substance use disorders are. And, the longer I thought about it after reading these stats, because to be honest with you, I just couldn't believe they were that low. But, there are plenty of people who, after the end of the day or at the weekend, they'd swing by the store, pick up a couple 12-packs of beer or wine or spirits, go home, and spend the weekend at home getting drunk. When would they ever have an opportunity to get into legal trouble? And so I'm guessing that's true with these others. People, however they do it, go and score their cocaine or their heroin. They go home, or wherever they hang out, they use, and they don't bother anyone. So it's very interesting because, of course, as I said, my perspective was very, very narrow, coming from working with court-ordered people. Now, something they did add, which I thought was interesting, was they took out the recurrent legal problems and they added craving or strong desire or urge to use. It's kind of an iffy criteria because it's a little more a little judgmental. How do you determine what a strong desire is? I mean, do you experience cravings or a strong desire? On a scale of 1 to 10, how strong is your desire? See how it's kind of iffy? How do you quantify craving or strong desire? But there are two reasons why it was added. One of them is the World Health Organization uses it, also known as WHO. And DSM is trying to line up with the World Health Organization. For the longest time, they kind of competed with each other for superiority. But probably in the last 10 years, there have been an effort to increase cooperation and uniformity across the globe. The United States is the only country that uses the DSM. Everybody else uses the ICD-9. Actually, it'll be 10 fairly soon, which is the International Code of Disorders. We're the only ones that don't use it. And for the most part, DSM and ICD cooperate with each other, but not always. And so a desire with DSM-5 and ICD-10 and 11 is to make them completely compatible. And so DSM added this criteria for craving or strong desire or urge to use. The other reason is money. There is a lot of money behind psychiatric problems because we have the pharmaceutical industry cranking out the newest drug to take care of the world's ills. And so if you add craving or strong desire, boom, now you've created a pocket for the pharmaceutical industry to fill with drugs that reduce cravings. It's all money driven. I wish I could say it wasn't, but it is. And so I have the new criteria here. In some cases I cut corners because I really don't need to retype it. You just need to understand the overview. So I only picked alcohol use disorder because I can't write them all out. But alcohol use disorder is a problematic pattern of alcohol use leading to significant impairment or distress as evidenced by two of the following symptoms occurring within a 12-month period. Alcohol is often taken in larger amounts or over a longer period than when it was intended. So if you have someone who, when they wake up in the morning, they say, I'm not going to drink today, or they are going out to watch a football game with friends and they make a deal with themselves, I will just have one. And then by the time the game is over, they're drunk off their butts. That's alcohol taken in larger amounts and over a longer period than was intended. Persistent desire or unsuccessful attempts to cut down or control use. I always use treatment episodes as an example of this. And so if you've had someone who's been in treatment twice and they're back in front of you still in active addiction, to me, those are two unsuccessful attempts at trying to cut down or control use. But again, if someone says, yes, I white-knuckled it for 30 days and then I went on a drinking binge, then that fits the criteria too. Or, same thing, making that promise with yourself. Just for today, I'm not going to drink, and then they drink. A great deal of time spent in activities to obtain alcohol, use it, and recover from it. That one's fairly self-explanatory. Craving or strong desire or urge to use. Already covered that. Failure to fulfill major role obligations. And that depends on the person. This could be work, school, or at home. And so if you have someone who was an A student their first 2 semesters and then they started drinking, missing class, blah, 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 they've gone from an A to a D, that's a failure to fill their major role. If you have someone who's having problems with absenteeism, missing a lot of work, making a lot of school excuses, missing a lot of deadlines, that fits this category. And same thing, if you have someone who isn't taking care of the house, maybe gets behind on bills, doesn't clean, dishes are piled up in the sink, again, falls under this criteria. Continued use despite negative consequences. That's kind of our catch-all phrase. The DSM actually has continued alcohol use despite having persistent or recurrent social or interpersonal problems caused or exacerbated by alcohol's effects. I just abbreviated it. You could possibly put legal problems under this one. So if you do have someone with 2 DUIs, you know what? That pretty much is going to be a recurrent problem. If you have someone who constantly gets drunk and loud and your friends and the friends complain about it, and the behavior doesn't change, same thing, that would fall under this as well. Important social, occupational, and recreational activities given up or reduced because of alcohol. Well, again, if you have someone whose life is consumed by alcohol, it could be something along the lines of someone who used to play softball and drops out. Or it could be, a mom who keeps on promising her daughter she'll attend her soccer game, but she doesn't. Or someone who lets their job go. Or doesn't get a promotion because their behavior due to the alcohol is causing problems. Recurrent use in hazardous situations. I'd put DUI under this as well, but that's just me. And, other crazy stuff that people can do under the influence. Continued use when it's known that their physical or psychological problems are caused by or aggravated by continued use. If someone knows they have cirrhosis of the liver and they're still drinking, that fits this criteria. If someone has a psychiatric disorder, schizophrenia, depression, anxiety, you can't drink on that medication. It's kind of pointless if you drink on that medication. You just have really expensive urine. And so anyone who's taking those meds and is aware that they don't work and play well together, that falls under this category. But also, quite frequently, if you have depression and you're using a depressant, which is alcohol, it isn't going to get any better. It's only going to get worse. And so that would fall under this as well. Tolerance, either by needing more or diminished effects when consuming the same amount. This one kind of puzzles some students. But this goes back to what I was telling you about those first two individuals, the one who was moderate and the other one who was severe. The closest thing that I can think of is a pressure cooker. And that's actually probably even becoming dated because people don't use pressure cookers anymore. But the concept behind a pressure cooker is you have, whatever you're cooking under pressure, and you have the steam rising. And so the pressure in the pressure cooker is rising. And then finally, it has to let off steam. That's actually where the phrase came from. And it plummets. And that pretty much is what happens to people who have developed what's called reverse tolerance. And so most people will tell you, after 2 beers I'm buzzed, after 5 beers I'm drunk, after 7 beers I'm, whatever. For someone with reverse tolerance, they no longer have that threshold. They have used so much that their body has reverse tolerance that there's no noticeable difference between consuming 5 beers and 12 beers. Your body's aware of it, but as far as behavior and stuff like that, no. And then finally, the 11th criteria is withdrawal or using to relieve or avoid withdrawal. So if you have withdrawal symptoms, then that's a criteria. But let's say you engage in early morning drinking to control your shaking, that also falls under this. And I always pick on Lindsay Lohan. So Lindsay's been to rehab at least 4 or 5 times. She has 2 DUIs. She's lost acting jobs due to her alcohol use. She has continued to drink despite her negative consequences. So you figure, even though she's lost these jobs, she's had problems with family and friends, she's had financial hardships, she continues to drink. I'm guessing she's consumed more than was intended. That was a guess on my part. And she has used despite a history of psychological issues. She's currently, at the time that she was admitted to one of her rehab programs, she was on Adderall, Zoloft, and Trazodone. Adderall is for attention deficit disorder, and Trazodone and Zoloft are for depression. You can't drink on those, especially the Trazodone and the Zoloft. It's not good to drink on the Adderall either. But she wasn't getting any better as far as any psychological issues like depression if she was drinking. And so that gives her 6 criteria. And if you flip over to the last slide, you will see she has 303.90, alcohol use disorder severe. Now, one thing that I didn't put is I didn't say whether or not she had physiological dependence, because that I don't actually know. I'd have to interview her. But if she does go through withdrawal, then you would add that specifier. And that's actually the only time dependence shows up in a diagnosis. If she was in rehab and she was clean, but she was in rehab, it would be in remission in a controlled environment, because you don't actually know what she would do if she was out in the real world. But that gives you an idea of how the DSM has changed. And one thing I want you to notice, okay, this is very important, is that really the DSM can be part of the public health model, but what do you notice missing from the DSM that it is part of the public health model? So it fits into the public health model, but the public health model doesn't fit into it. And if you notice, there is nothing in there about environment, genetics, upbringing, nothing. And so even though Lindsay was raised with two alcoholic or drug-addicted parents, it's not in there. Her social and environmental, it's how she responds to it, not how it impacts her. And so you lose that biopsychosocial response. To be honest with you, DSM doesn't really care why she became an addict. It doesn't look for sources or anything like that. It's just a diagnosis. And so it doesn't give the full picture of Lindsay. It just gives this truncated view of here is how alcohol is messing her life up and to what degree. And so that's why for us, it's not sufficient. It doesn't give us a holistic view of Lindsay. It just gives us one perspective. But we have to understand this perspective, because if we don't, we're not going to get paid, because that little code 303.90 is what insurance companies require in order for us to get reimbursement for providing services.